on George's neck. This was a brutal and public display of an 8-minute prolonged death. This was the lowest level of human respect and dignity that any community should ever have to endure. What this really was the weight of the Minneapolis Police Department on George's neck. And what you're going to hear from the doctors is that there were 2 actual physical mechanisms that were in place that caused George Floyd's death. As Ben alluded to, not only was the knee on George's neck a cause of his death, but so was the weight of the other 2 police officers on his back, who not only prevented blood flow into his brain, but also airflow into his lungs. That makes all of those officers on scene criminally liable and without a doubt civilly responsible. Had the Minnesota Police Department instituted the reforms it promised it would when it came to chokeholds and restraints, George would be alive. That's because the Minnesota Police Department, through its custom practices and policies, failed to train its police officers, failed to discipline police officers like Officer Chauvin, kept them there, kept them on scene, kept them on the police department. The Minneapolis Police Department promised that it would train its police officers on chokeholds and restraints. It promised that back as long as 2013, and it failed to do it. What you see on the video is exactly what happened. Those police officers were the proximate cause of George Floyd's death. And that's what you're going to hear in medical terminology from the doctors who will speak after me. This represents extreme and systemic failures on the part of the Minneapolis Police Departments. Opportunities not only that they had on the day that this happened, but for years and years to eliminate the institutional bias and racism against people of color. George Floyd was pronounced guilty before they even knew what he did. He was a non-violent offender. From what we know, it was a $20 counterfeit bill. And what did we see take place? You saw in action the blue shield. That police officer who stood in front and watched while the other 3 police officers held him down, he's culpable too. That's the blue shield in action. There was no prevention on anyone's part to save George's life. Sometime tomorrow, you're also going to hear from a brave man, one of the witnesses who was on scene. He's going to speak to you also. He's going to speak to you because he was within feet of what was happening. He watched the public execution unfold because those officers knew that by continuing to restrain and choke, that they could end a life. A grade school child understands the basics that if you continue to choke a human being, that you will end a life. This brave young man will speak to you tomorrow about what he saw, about George, about what he was feeling as he knew he was dying, calling for his mother. Make no mistake, as I said earlier, this is not only about Officer Chauvin and those police officers. This is about the Minneapolis Police Department and its policies. Ladies and gentlemen, this death will not be in vain. There will be permanent and lifelong lasting change as a result of George's death. We will not let that go unescaped. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony Robinucci. I'm very honored to stand with you as a very capable lawyer that with our team of expert legal minds will get justice, full justice for George Floyd. And it is imperative that we understand, as we all demand justice, that we have to look not only at the video that tells us in common sense what happened, but that we apply that with the forensic science, because it's critical. And one should not suggest that we didn't see what we saw, and what we saw should be consistent with what the science purports. As Attorney Robinucci and I have said, the ambulance was a hearse. Why was this? Because not only the knee to his neck, but also the knees to his back that compressed his lungs and frustrated them from being able to contract, to take air in and out. So even if there's an opinion that there was no harm to his trachea, that is not conclusive in any way as to what caused his death. These doctors are going to explain it to you as the medical professionals they are, but as a simple person being a voice for equal justice, trying to tell the people who watched that video, that horrific video, when everybody else could see that they were killing them, except the police, or did they? No, they were killing them. You can look at the knees to the back as we've all looked at the knees to his neck, because they are both significant. Mr. Floyd's death was a homicide by the officers who taunted him while holding him down for more than 8 minutes. And the officers who stood by Tony by doing nothing, as you said, was a physical blue shield. The blue shield we always talk about in the Black community. A living symbol of the code of silence from these suggested good officers, seeing bad officers brutalize us, but saying nothing. Thank God there were witnesses and video on that night as George struggled for breath. At this time, I am honored to introduce a new voice from the medical field in these type matters. I know Dr. Baden and I have worked on several of these matters together, but today it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Alicia Wilson, Director of Autopsy and Forensic Sciences at the University of Michigan. Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon. We acknowledge that additional medical information, including toxicology and further investigation, are necessary for a final report. However, the evidence is consistent with mechanical asphyxia as the cause of death and homicide as the manner of death. Second autopsies in certain cases can be very important to confirm and or dispute the original diagnosis, to answer those unanswered questions, to collect and document evidence, and most importantly, to determine the cause and the manner of death. While beneficial, second autopsies do have their limitations as we are not seeing the tissues in their original state, and some items may have been kept by the original pathologist. With that acknowledgement, we feel those items will not change or alter the primary cause of death of mechanical asphyxia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Incredibly honored to have you do this autopsy on behalf of the Floyd family. It means a lot more than you know to them and many of us. At this time, I will call a man that really needs no introduction. Dr. Michael Baden is one of the foremost forensic scientists in the world alive today. He has worked on some of the most high-profile autopsies in the modern era. He has a background in doing forensic pathology, not only for the police departments, but also for the social justice engineers like myself and Tony. I could go on and on about Dr. Michael Baden, but I think it best to hear him explain the autopsy and put it in context as only the great Dr. Michael Baden can. Dr. Baden.
Thank you, Ben. The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. This is confirmed by information provided to Dr. Wilson and myself from the family. He was in good health. The compressive pressure of the neck and back are not seen at autopsy because the pressure has been released by the time the body comes to the medical examiner's office. It can only be seen, serious compressive pressure on the neck and back can only be seen while the pressure is being applied, or when, as in this instance, it is captured on video. And in this instance, we can see after a little bit less than 4 minutes that Mr. Floyd is motionless, lifeless, and when the EMS arrived and put him on the stretcher without any CPR at that time, during the ambulance trip, he did not respond to CPR and did not respond to cardiac shock. The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing. When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true. I am talking and talking and talking and not breathing in front of you. So the concept that a person says, "I can't breathe," like Mr. Garner, like in this instance, means you should take it seriously. And I think that I've finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baden. And again, to you and Dr. Wilson, on behalf of the George family, they are so very grateful that you perform this autopsy for them. And we know some of the things are going to make people emotional because this is an emotional case. Watching a person die is always just a horrific emotional thing, but to watch an individual die like this is something that causes a psychological scar in an individual's mind that is never repaired. The scar tissue of George Floyd's death will be permanent scar tissue on the subconscious of America. And we say again, as emotional as this is, let's all take a breath, not just for justice, not just for peace, but take a breath to heal our communities all across America. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George in peace, because that's what George would have wanted. And I'm honored again to be with Attorney Tony Ramanucci, Attorney Storms, Attorney Ravindran, Attorney Ward, Attorney Stewart, these great lawyers who are representing the family of George Floyd. We're going to take some of your questions now. Please type them in the Q&A box and identify yourself and your media organization. For those who haven't done this before, you can click on the small hand icon on the right-hand side of your screen to make sure that you have a question. And we will open the floor to questions.
Will you be making copies of the autopsy available? This question's for the doctor.
Dr. Baden or Dr. Whitson?
We will certainly make the copies of the autopsies that Dr. Wilson and Dr. and I prepare, but we do have to wait for all the results before we complete our reports. But certainly each of us has concluded that on the basis of all the information available, the cause of death is what was seen at the time of the death. He couldn't breathe, asphyxia due to compression of the neck and of the back, and that's homicidal. And that will be in the final report.
And Attorney Ramanucci is going to make a comment about that. But that's very important. The cause and manner of death was because he could not breathe, mechanical asphyxia, and it was homicide.
So it's important that in the legal world, we describe this very simply. It's called a but-for event. Just those two words. But for the sustained pressure on his neck and on his back, George Floyd would be alive. That's the simple premise here. And that choke and that pressure, which we know is an illegal maneuver, turned into deadly force. So what the officers tried to use as an attempt at non-deadly force turned deadly as they continued to sustain pressure on his neck and back. And that's why this is homicide, because it's death by the hands of another.
Next questions.
Sarah Meerhoff with Forum News Service in the Twin Cities asks if Mr. Crump has a comment on Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison taking over of the case from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office.
I will report that the family of George Floyd was encouraged that the governor appointed Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison to the case because they had great distrust with the Minneapolis Police Department based on the false information they presented in the report on day one that never mentioned anything about a knee on George's neck and George asking for breath, saying, "I can't breathe," over and over and over again, with witnesses saying, "You're killing him." And so the family, and I believe Keith Ellison is a welcomed prosecutor to zealously prosecute this case. Now, we don't want to have anybody not continue to be vigilant for the cause of justice. We think Keith Ellison has understood his whole career that we have two justice systems in America, unfortunately, one for Black America and one for white America. And what we must have is equal justice for the United States of America. So the family employs Attorney General Ellison to make equal justice real for Black people in 2020 with getting those officers arrested immediately and charged to the fullest extent of the law, so we can believe that there's one justice system in America based on what we saw in that videotape.
Banks asks if any of the funeral arrangements and plans in Houston can be shared at this time.
Yes, we will announce that in Minneapolis, there will be a memorial here Thursday at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. On Saturday, there will be a memorial service in North Carolina, where he was born, at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And then on Tuesday, June the 9th, the funeral will take place in Houston, Texas at 11 a.m. And on the Monday preceding the funeral, there will be a public viewing that evening.
Thank you. Ivan Pereira from ABC News asks, for Dr. Baden, you previously conducted an independent autopsy of Eric Garner following his death. How does Mr. Floyd's examination compare to Mr. Garner's?
Thank you. Yes, I was asked by the family of Eric Garner to do a second examination, but what is different is the initial autopsy in the New York City Medical Examiner's Office concluded on day one that there was enough evidence to show that he died of asphyxia, because he couldn't breathe because of the compression of his neck and back. And that was immediately put on the death certificate, as opposed to this situation, which is the more common situation, where things are left pending while additional studies are done that will not reflect on the cause of death. It'll reflect on the circumstances of death, but whether he has drugs or alcohol in his body, for example, is not a cause of death. It would be a circumstance of a cause of death. But with Eric Garner, with a video that's still on the internet, a 2-minute video of Eric Garner on the internet, showing him saying, I can't breathe many times, and that he becomes lifeless as Mr. Floyd dead within 45 seconds. From the moment the 4 police officers touch him until they get away because they know he's lifeless was about 45 seconds. And so there are similarities, and that in that instance, there was a waiting time between the Justice Department and the New York City Police Department without any charges being brought with no criminal charges being brought against the officer that did most of that compression. And it just goes to show that no matter how much video you have, there are many obstacles in the criminal justice system in this country, especially when it comes to Black people who die while being restrained by white police, unfortunately. And I'm somebody, as mentioned, 50 years I worked with city and state police in New York. And I am very pro police work in general, but there are more than a few rotten apples that come up in the deaths that occur during police restraints, and that has to be further addressed, and hopefully this will help do that.
Thank you, Dr. Baden. I know Attorney Tony Ramanucci and Attorney Stewart and Attorney Storms, echo that sentiment, and that's what we endeavor to do with this case of George Floyd. It is a tipping point case, and the sincere hope is that this case will help change the system, bring needed reform. I have been texted by a news service to ask, what is the recap of our autopsy? And it's simply this. Number one, the knee to the neck and the knees to his back both contributed to him not being able to get breath. And what those officers did there that we see on the video is the cause of his death, not some underlying unknown health condition. George Floyd was a healthy young man. We see in the video he was walking, breathing, he was alive. His cause of death medically was mechanical asphyxiation. The legal determination is homicide. That is it in a nutshell. The officers killed him based on a knee to his neck for almost 9 minutes and 2 knees on his back, compressing his lungs. The ambulance was his hearse. Next question.
From Audra Birch, what charges do you want for the additional 3 officers?
Attorney Ramanucci will take that question.
So in terms of criminal charges, there is no doubt that those police officers are criminally liable also. We will leave it up to Attorney General Ellison to be transparent, to be fair, to review the evidence in the totality of the circumstances. But I urge anyone who looks at that video and reviews the entire evidence that not only were constitutional violations abound here, but this was criminal. They knew that they were employing restraints that could or might cause death. And by having that knowledge and by continuing to mount the pressure on his body, restricting his airway and cutting off blood to his brain, they knew that they would cause death. To be culpable of murder or homicide, you only need to know that what you are doing could lead to death. They were trained, supposedly, that those restraints could or might cause death. They need to be charged criminally. They are criminally liable because they knew that what they were doing could lead to death. And indeed, we know that it did cause his death.
Raina S. from Care.
Thank you, Attorney Ramanucci. And just to be clear, George Floyd family wants first-degree murder for Officer Chauvin and the other officers to be charged to the full extent of the law because George was their blood. imagine someone who is your family and during the last moments of his life on this earth, begging for humanity, begging to be treated like a human being, begging to be treated like one of God's children. They want a first-degree murder charge. They want equal justice for African Americans because Black Lives Matter and George Floyd life mattered.
Rena S. from Care 11 News asks, do the doctors believe the information about underlying conditions? Oh, I apologize. Rena S. from Care 11 News asks, and are the doctors basing the cause of death solely on the video and not the autopsy?
When looking at the case, the entire investigation, including the autopsy, are very important. The determination of cause and manner of death are based on the circumstances surrounding the death, which does include the video, but also additional findings that were determined at our autopsy. We do have physical evidence that supports that there was pressure applied to his neck. And it's in this combination with the additional medical information that we have, including examination of all of the other organs that were available to us in making our determination of cause of death.
And Dr. Baden, could you speak just to the physical abrasions to his head and face and how that contributed to your determinations?
Yes, as Dr. Wilson said, we take everything we have into consideration. The forensic autopsy starts at the scene. Much time in most homicide cases relates to reconstructing the scene. Detectives going out and interviewing people, all kinds of forensic science work, picking up trace evidence. In this instance, the video tells you what the scene is. The video is real. The multiple videos are real. And those multiple videos show pressure that can cause death, and his calling out, like Eric Garner, but also including calling out for his mother, who had been dead for 3 years. None of this caused a release of the pressure. And that is very disturbing. Now, what was the question?
Abrasions to his head and face.
Thank you. There were rough abrasions around the left eye and the left cheek, and a little bit in the front of on the nose and mouth areas that are due, as we can see in the video, to the left side of his face being rubbed against the pavement, while the left knee of the officer is squeezing down on the left side of the neck, which would be, the neck is a small area with many vital organs, arteries, veins, nerves, and the windpipe, all of which are compressed with the knee activity as seen on the video. So that the abrasions on the side of the neck and the nose would also indicate that a component of the interference with breathing it was also some pressures that were placed on the nose and mouth. And these are also very painful kinds of scrape marks. There was also severe scrape marks on the back of his left shoulder, which is part of the activity that was causing him to rub against his knee, the officer's knee, as well as the face being on the ground. And those occurred while he was still alive and breathing.
And is that evidence of pressure?
That is evidence of severe pressure on the face, large areas of scraping abrasions on the face, in particular, left side of the face, which is evidence of his face being rubbed severely against the ground.
What Dr. Baden said is also very important for the prior question of the criminal charges, because what was happening on that video is extremely important, because when the brave young man that you're going to hear from tomorrow was trying to attempt life-saving statements to the police officers, or when George Floyd was calling out that he can't breathe or for his mother, you could see, at least from one of the angles, the first angle that was released, that Officer Chauvin was readjusting his knee in order to further compress that tight area of the neck. That is an expression of knowledge. That taunt of readjusting his knee in order to further compress the airway and hold him down with that sustained pressure is evidence of criminal conduct.
Liz Navratil from the Star Tribune asks the doctors if your autopsy found any evidence of the heart disease or other underlying conditions.
Dr. Baden or Dr. Wilson?
As I've mentioned previously, certain parts of the organs have been retained by the original pathologist. In the sections that we have and in the specimens that we examine, there is no significant underlying disease of the heart. The sections of the vessels that we examined were clear of atherosclerosis. The sections that have been retained, we will examine once they can be made available to us.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that.
I'd just like to add on, in my coronavirus susceptible age group, that I wish I had the same coronary arteries that Mr. Floyd had, that we saw at the autopsy.
Thank you for putting that in context for us, Dr. Baden.
Yamichi at PBS NewsHour asks, can the doctors determine at this time how long it took Mr. Floyd to die?
Yeah. I counted the video from the time the video started, which was a few seconds apparently after Mr. Floyd was pushed on the ground and the knee put on the neck. Counts about 3 minutes and 50 seconds between the time he's on the ground and the time he becomes motionless, at a time when the passers-by, the civilians who were watching and photographing, yelled out that he was dying, that he was lifeless, that he should be permitted to get up, that he's dying, that he's going to be dead. From the moment, 3 minutes and plus seconds, he was motionless. He had no evidence of breathing, of struggling, and remained that way for another 4 or 5 minutes with the knee on his neck until the EMS people arrived and found he had no pulse, he had a cardiac arrest. They tried CPR, they tried shock to the heart, nothing worked, and he did not recover. In my opinion, he died. He was dead after about 4 or 5 minutes. He was pronounced dead sometime later when he gets to a hospital. A person's alive in this country until a proper physician, usually a physician, pronounces him dead. But he appears to be dead before the EMT people get there, certainly.
And it's important to note the two EMT. It's important to note that the two EMT members, once they got to the scene, they had Lucas' device working on an unresponsive, pulseless male. They concluded in the ambulance, they performed pulse checks several times, finding none. and delivered one shock by their monitor, the patient's condition did not change. He remained unresponsive and pulseless. And that's why I said the ambulance that we see arrive on the scene was George Wilson's hearse. I'm sorry, the ambulance that we see arrive on the scene was George Floyd's hearse.
Question from Andrew Tangle from the Wall Street Journal. Do the medical examiner's results differ in professional opinion from the county medical examiner, or is that information you don't have yet?
At this time, we have not had the opportunity to review the actual preliminary report from the medical examiner who performed the autopsy. We have seen accounts from the complaint, and based on that, yes, our findings do differ. Some of the information I read from that complaint state that there was no evidence of traumatic asphyxia. This is the point in which we do disagree, that there is evidence in this case of mechanical or traumatic asphyxia.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for explaining that. Next question. Oh, Dr. Bobby. Okay. If you could speak louder with the questions. How many more? Okay. So we have 5 minutes left.
There are no further questions.
Okay. Thank you all. We will continue to keep you informed as we continue to move forward to getting justice for George Floyd. Thank you and God bless. And let's remember to take a breath, America. Let's take a breath for George. Let's take a breath for peace. Let's take a breath for justice. And let's take a breath to heal our country. Thank you.